Mr. Louis Chua.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to start by declaring my interest as an employee of a financial institution here in Singapore. Mr. Speaker, I would like to begin by extending my support for the Significant Infrastructure Government Loan Act, or SINGA in short. In October last year, I shared that there is scope to rethink Singapore's position on debt instead of funding our expenditures solely with higher cost equity funding or funding from our reserves. This is especially if the funds are being used for quality investment projects that will benefit current and future generations of Singaporeans. Today's bill represents an important milestone for us as a country, and while it may have been a little later than some had hoped, it is indeed better late than never. In finance, we often speak of an optimal capital structure for a firm, the ability to have a proportion of debt and equity that results in the lowest weighted average cost of capital when making the capital management decision. While certain commentators may liken government finances to a household budget, unlike a household, firms and countries can be assumed to last into perpetuity. Debt is not inherently bad per se, and if it can be employed effectively to increase returns or result in a lower WACC on an overall basis, then it should always be considered as a viable option. Moreover, while we can have a different philosophical view of what the ideal structure should be on the national level, we must be keenly aware that equity funding or funding from our reserves is not free. I would now like to take the time to seek some clarifications on several points in this bill. The first is on the capitalization of expenditure on nationally significant infrastructure. Again, this is another welcome change from an alignment of accounting practices point of view. After all, the long useful lives of infrastructure projects does suggest that they clearly fall under the accounting definition of an asset, as it is a present economic resource that has the potential to produce economic benefits. This change is in contrast to the current practice of charging off development expenditure annually. So as an example, a 1 billion project today with a useful life of 50 years is charged to the financial statements at 2% annually, which represents about a 20 million depreciation charge. This is a fraction of what it would have been had we stuck to the current accounting treatment. In FY 2018 and FY 2019, actual total development expenditure was 20.3 billion and 16.7 billion respectively, while the revised development expenditure in 2020 was 16.4 billion and the estimated expenditure in 2021 will be 19.9 billion. Mr. Speaker, I would like to ask, based on the adoption of capitalizing long-term assets as an accounting treatment, how much of our development expenditure in dollar terms will be freed up annually? The second point I would like to talk about is the type of projects which have been identified for the purpose of SINGA. These include infrastructure intended for a list of specific purposes as listed in Section 2, such as transport, water treatment, elevation of floods, etc. The new MRT lines, such as the next phases of the Thomson East Coast Line, the Jurong Regional Line and Cross Island Line, as well as the extension of current lines such as the North East Line, Downtown Line, and projects such as the Deep Tunnel Sewage System as mentioned by DP and Heng, are projects that will fall under the scope of SINGA. I would like to ask the DPM, how was the final list of use categories identified and chosen? My colleague James has built a strong case for human capital as a form of soft infrastructure investment. And indeed, when we look at US President Biden's $2 trillion infrastructure plan, we see that it includes the planned funding of the care economy, which includes $400 billion towards expanding access to quality, affordable, home or community-based care for the elderly and people with disabilities. It will also cover investments in schools, childcare facilities, and workforce development programs, among others. In a knowledge-based economy, intellectual and human capital are just as important, if not more important, than physical hard assets. We should not solely be focusing on conventional property, plant, and equipment as possible infrastructure projects to finance with borrowing. As it is, Intellectual property and other intangible assets can already be capitalized under a firm's balance sheet under accounting rules given the recognition of the economic benefits that they generate. As a government, we should seriously consider this as an extension of the Singa Bill as compared to only that of traditional infrastructure assets. Third, I note that these projects need to have a useful life of at least 50 years. As shared by my colleague James, many existing infrastructure projects would not have qualified under this rather long time span. I'm concerned about how practical that might be in an era where technological and environmental needs are changing so rapidly. If climate change were indeed a motivating factor for the need for infrastructure changes, it would be far from accurate to assume that any infrastructure planning now will be useful for the next 50 years. Rapid technological changes have shaped the tech infrastructure needed to keep our economy competitive. Over the past 20 years, we have moved from an era of 3G cellular networks in the 2000s to 4G in the 2010s, and finally the rolling out of 5G networks from 2020. That is a roughly 10-year gap between each generation of cellular networks. It will be extremely difficult for anyone to predict with utmost confidence if the infrastructure we are building for 5G today, for example, would continue to be relevant 10 or even 20 years down the line, let alone 50 years at a minimum. Our MRT systems are another example. First constructed more than 30 years ago, the replacement of sleepers, signaling equipment, track upgrading and power supply systems over the last couple of years have meant that it is as good as replacing the entire system with a brand new set. Even power plants such as one of the newer CCGT plants in Singapore only have a useful life of around 25 years. My fourth point covers that of green financing. We aspire to be a green hub, and we have laid out grand plans in our current Singapore Green Plan 2030. From my understanding, some of these projects, such as the Tuas Nexus, have been identified. In trying to keep up in line with these aims, I would like to ask the DPM, out of the $90 billion set aside for Singa, how much of these will be set aside for green infrastructure? As a government, we should aspire to lead by example and set a laudable target for how much we plan to spend on green infrastructure itself. Further, I believe the financing of nationally significant infrastructure should be tied to the mandatory completion of rigorous environmental, heritage and social impact assessments done using the best available science at reasonable cost. Such studies should be made fully available to the public for feedback and for the public to take any private mitigation measures if necessary. This would then allow the full buy-in from society at large on the benefits of such infrastructure projects. I recognize that advisory services such as the associated design, investigative and engineering studies, surveys or research are already deemed as qualifying capital expenditure. The key caveat here, of course, is that such advisory services have to be reasonable relative to the total project costs. Even though I'm sure there are many considerations and technical challenges to work through, it would be unwise if consultancy fees end up being 90% of the cost of the actual project, for example. So I wonder if the government would also include limits on how much will be spent on advisory fees as compared to the overall construction cost of the project. The fifth point I would like to cover looks at some of the numbers as specified within the Singa Bill. The first question is on the 90 billion loan limit which has been put in place. Debt levels in itself cannot be seen in isolation, and we need to assuage Singaporeans that the level of borrowing is not unsustainable. Credit rating agencies often compare debt levels to net worth or net assets, or in the case of sovereign credit ratings, usable reserves, for example. My question for DPM, therefore, is how much does this 90 billion represent relative to Singapore's current account receipts and reserves? Further, Minister Ong Ye Kung has mentioned that we will need to spend more than 60 billion over this decade to expand and renew our rail networks, while PM Lee has mentioned that Singapore is probably going to spend 100 billion, possibly more, to protect our country against rising sea levels. I would thus like to ask the DPM to put into context how is this sum of $90 billion of debt financing determined, and if there are any quantifiable targets such as the total expected infrastructure spending in dollar terms over the next 1 to 2 decades. And how much of the funds are already earmarked for specific projects. On the total effective interest paid or payable of 5 billion, that would imply a total yield to maturity of 5.6% on the loan limit of 90 billion. How does this compare to the current and future expected Singapore government securities yields that the ministry is projecting? Singapore's 10-year bond yields stand about 1.5% today, while 30-year bond yields are about 1.9%. Based on my checks, historical average bond yields of varying bond durations are only about 2.5 to 2.8%, notwithstanding a wide range of between less than 1% to almost 5-6%. But yet this is significantly lower, the average is significantly lower than the implied yield to maturity of 5.6%. Lastly, with regards to the qualifying amount of capital expenditure being at least $4 billion or more, I would like to ask the DPM how this number was derived as well. In 2008, the KPE was built at a cost of $1.8 billion. Inflation notwithstanding, the value that the project has brought to Singaporeans has been immense, especially residents staying in the northeast, such as that of our Sengkang residents. In 2014, the 800 megawatt state-of-the-art power plant by Pacific Light was built at a cost of $1.2 billion. Despite the size and value that these projects bring, they hardly come close to the qualifying amount of $4 billion or more. There is also a question of whether the definition of nationally significant infrastructure being defined under Part 1 as being geographically located in Singapore may restrict the spending needs from infrastructure that crosses borders. A nationally significant infrastructure, the Linggil Reservoir, which Singapore built at a cost of more than $300 million in Malaysia, comes to mind. Further, should the government decide to set a much more ambitious renewable energy target, the infrastructure cost for the import of electricity, especially solar electricity from overseas, would also not fall within the purview of this Singa Bill. Mr. Speaker, I would like to conclude with two parting thoughts. The first is that I agree with DPM Heng that there should be various strict safeguards on the projects that can qualify for borrowing and the amounts that can be borrowed. Similarly, when it comes to the use of our reserves via the NIRC, it too has strict safeguards in place. Ultimately, any sound policy decision should have safeguards built in, and hence if we decide to tap on Singapore's ample fiscal space to fund our investments into our people, we should not fear the slippery slope of there not being any safeguards that can be put in place. The second is that, again, I agree with DPM Heng that borrowing for nationally significant infrastructure will spread these lumpy expenditures across the generations who will benefit. If we want to be a progressive society that firmly believes in the principles of fairness, we should also be acutely aware that the converse is also true. Besides Changi Airport's Terminal 1 and 2 and the first MRT project, the government has not borrowed to fund other infrastructure projects since the 90s. In essence, a generation that came before us has borne the significant cost of infrastructure development upfront for our benefit without having the cost spread equitably across generations. Despite a lifetime of hard work and contribution to our nation, sadly more than half of our seniors do not appear to have sufficient funds to retire comfortably. We should never forget the sacrifices the earlier generations of Singaporeans have made in building this nation and must always keep this in mind. Needless to say, we should never contemplate taking any future decision that could potentially add to their tax burden. Mr. Speaker, I support the bill.